Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into one of the most underrated organs you have.
Underrated. Which one are you thinking of?
Today it's all about the small intestine. We'll be using this physiology handout from Dr. Rasha Eldeeb, by the way.
Ah, the small intestine. Yeah, lots of folks don't give it much thought.
I know, right? But it's not just about dry anatomy. We're going on a journey to see how this thing, well, how it keeps us alive.
It really is amazing when you think about it. People just kind of think of it as a tube, but it's way more than that.
It's where digestion finishes up, but it's also the star player for absorbing all the good stuff. Nutrients, water, those electrolytes, everything your body needs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And don't forget, all that absorption means it has to balance things carefully. The small intestine is critical in keeping your water levels right, and that's linked to maintaining that whole acid-base balance throughout your system.
Wow, so it's not just processing food, it's keeping your whole internal environment in check. That's pretty impressive for a long tube.
It is impressive. Speaking of long, we're talking about a structure that goes all the way from the pylorus, the exit of your stomach.
To the cecum, where your large intestine begins. It's a long journey.
It is. And along the way, it's divided into three sections: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, each with its own specializations.
But honestly, what blew my mind prepping for this was the sheer surface area.
Oh, absolutely. It needs a massive surface area to do all that absorbing. And it achieves that with, well, some really incredible adaptations.
It's not just about being long, right?
Yeah.
You've got three levels of folds and projections. There are those mucosal folds, the big wrinkles you can actually see.
Right, and then on those you have villi, those finger-like projections covering the whole inner surface.
And as if that wasn't enough, each cell on a villus has its own tiny projections called microvilli. It's like a fractal landscape maximizing surface area everywhere.
Exactly. It's mind-boggling how much is packed in.
Okay, get this. When you add up all those folds, the surface area of your small intestine is about the size of a tennis court.
It's a great way to visualize it. But this amazing structure needs workers, right? Those cellular characters. We've got to talk about intestinal glands, the crypts of Lieberkühn.
Oh yeah, those glands tucked between the villi, those are all about secretion, right?
Right. They pump out all sorts of substances that are key for digestion and absorption.
And what about those Brunner's glands? Those are in the duodenum, right?
Ah, yes, the Brunner's glands. They're essential for creating the right environment for digestion. They secrete an alkaline fluid that helps neutralize the stomach acid.
So it's like a buffer zone, making sure things don't get too acidic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Speaking of protection, let's not forget about Peyer's patches.
Right. Peyer's patches are in the ileum, and they're like the immune system's watchtowers.
Exactly. They play a critical role in, well, defending against anything nasty that tries to sneak in through your food.
It's a constant battle down there. But back to those hard-working cells. What about the enterocytes? Those lining the villi, they do most of the absorbing, don't they?
They do. And their life cycle is fascinating. They're born deep down in those crypts we mentioned and migrate up the villi as they mature.
It's like a constant conveyor belt of cells being renewed.
Exactly. And as they journey, they change jobs. Young ones focus on secretion, pumping out substances into the intestine, but as they mature, they become absorption specialists, taking in nutrients and water.
Wow, that's incredible specialization. It's not just one cell doing everything. There's a whole dynamic process going on.
Absolutely. And speaking of dynamic processes, we have to talk about the secretions of the small intestine itself. It's more than just mucus.
Oh, right. That mysterious succus entericus. It always sounds kind of sinister.
Uh-huh. Maybe the name. But succus entericus is actually vital for digestion.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's in this stuff?
Mostly water. But it also has electrolytes, mucus, and enzymes. It helps create the right environment for breaking down and absorbing nutrients.
So how much of this stuff are we talking about?
Your small intestine makes about a liter of succus entericus per day.
A liter? I never knew my gut was such a busy factory. And I've heard it has well, a particular aroma.
Some have described it as slightly fishy, not the most pleasant, but it's a sign your gut is working hard.
I'll try to think of it as the smell of efficiency. We're not done with secretions, though, right? There's water and chloride secretion, too.
Absolutely. And this is where balance is critical. Imagine you're eating something salty. You get thirsty, right?
Makes sense. Salt makes you thirsty.
Well, chloride ions are pumped into the small intestine, and water follows to keep things balanced.
So it creates a salty environment that attracts water.
Precisely. This makes a fluid environment for the chyme, making it easier to mix with enzymes and absorb nutrients.
But doesn't all that water inflow mean we're, well, on the verge of problems?
That's where absorption comes in. It's a balanced system. But this balance can go wrong, like with cholera.
Cholera, that's serious, isn't it?
It is. The cholera toxin messes with the chloride secretion, causing tons of water to pump into the intestines.
Leading to severe diarrhea.
Exactly. Which can be life-threatening because of dehydration.
So it's like the small intestine's water system goes haywire.
Exactly. It shows how crucial that balance is. But let's move on to another key player, the enzyme.
Ah, yes, the enzymes. They're the ones that actually break down food into smaller absorbable bits, right?
Right. And the small intestine makes a whole bunch of them, each with a specific target.
Okay. Hit me with the lineup.
We've got enterokinase, enteropeptidases, lipase. It's a whole crew.
That's a lot of players.
Enterokinase is first up. It activates trypsinogen, which is made in the pancreas, but needs a jump start.
So one enzyme activates another, like dominoes.
Exactly. And trypsin is key for breaking down proteins. Then come the enteropeptidases, breaking those proteins further into amino acids.
Okay, so we need those guys to actually get the building blocks of protein from our food.
Absolutely. Without enough enteropeptidases, you get serious protein digestion problems. Then there's lipase, breaking down fats into fatty acids and monoglycerides. Those are what the small intestine can absorb.
Gotcha. And we can't forget the disaccharidases. They tackle those double sugars.
Right. We're talking maltase, sucrase, and lactase. Each breaks down its specific sugar into simpler parts for absorption.
Here's something I find interesting. Lactase, the one that breaks down milk sugar, actually decreases after we're weaned. That's why lactose intolerance is more common as we age.
It's fascinating how our digestive needs change. Speaking of changes, how does the small intestine control all those secretions? It's not just random, right?
Well, that's what I was wondering. Is it all about hormones?
It's a mix of things. In the duodenum, hormones like secretin and CCK stimulate secretions from Brunner's glands and the pancreas.
So it's a coordinated response when food arrives in the duodenum.
Exactly. But in the rest of the small intestine, the big trigger is actually the food itself.
So it's like the small intestine saying, hey, there's work to do.
Exactly. And of course, hormones like gastrin, CCK, secretin, even glucagon, they all fine-tune the process.
It's amazing how it all works together. But I'm ready for the main event. Let's talk absorption. That's what makes all this work worthwhile.
All right, let's dive into how your small intestine gets those nutrients into your bloodstream.
This is where the magic happens. It's one thing to break down food, but actually getting those nutrients into your body to use, that's the whole point.
Absolutely. It involves a whole bunch of specialized transport mechanisms. But before we get into specifics, there's a key player we need to talk about.
Okay, who's the star of the show?
Sodium. Sodium ions are actively transported out of the enterocytes, those absorbing cells. This creates a sort of pull that drives absorption of other nutrients.
Wait, so sodium is like the engine for the whole absorption process.
You got it. It creates a force that pulls other molecules along, like a revolving door. As sodium exits, it makes space for other nutrients to enter.
Great analogy. Sodium is making a vacuum that sucks other nutrients in.
Exactly. Now let's look at different nutrients, starting with carbohydrates.
Carbohydrates, those energy-giving sugars. I want to know how they get from my pasta to my muscles.
It starts by breaking down complex carbs into simple sugars, like glucose, galactose, and fructose.
Right, we can't absorb those big molecules directly.
Exactly. Once freed, those sugars need to cross into the bloodstream. Glucose and galactose are absorbed together using sodium, that revolving door system.
Hitching a ride with sodium.
You got it. Fructose is different. It uses a special transporter, but doesn't need sodium directly.
Like taking the express lane.
Good way to think about it. Once inside the enterocyte, all three use another transporter to get into the bloodstream.
So 2 doors, one into the cell, one into the blood.
Exactly. And here's something interesting. The absorption of those sugars is enhanced by hormones like thyroxine and adrenocortical hormones.
Our thyroid and adrenal glands are involved in carb absorption. Wow, I had no idea.
It all comes back to how interconnected our systems are. Everything's linked.
That's amazing. And speaking of amazing, did you know your small intestine can absorb over 5 kilograms of sucrose a day?
It's true. It's incredibly efficient.
Like a sugar processing plant. Okay, carbs are covered. Let's move on to protein, the building blocks for, well, everything.
Proteins are fascinating. Their absorption is specific, mainly happening in the jejunum.
That's why the protein in your stool isn't actually undigested food. It's from other stuff, right?
You got it. So those amino acids, the building blocks of protein, need to get from the intestine to the bloodstream. They do this using special carriers, each for a specific amino acid.
So like a sorting system with different doors for different amino acids.
Exactly. There's one for neutral amino acids, one for basic, one for acidic, and so on.
And sodium plays a role here too, right?
I bet. Most carriers need sodium. It creates that pull we talked about, moving amino acids into the enterocytes.
Sodium, the MVP again. It's like the key that unlocks the door for so many nutrients.
It is. Now, here's a fun fact. Babies can actually absorb whole proteins.
Wait, what?
Now,
How is that possible?
it's an adaptation that lets them get passive immunity from breast milk. The mother's antibodies pass directly into the baby's blood, protecting them from infections.
That's incredible. So why can't adults do that?
The ability fades with age, but tiny amounts can still get through, and that's unfortunately how food allergies develop.
So allergies are a side effect of something helpful in infancy. That's ironic.
It is, but it shows how intricate these processes are. Are you ready for fats? Their absorption is a bit more complex.
Bring it on. Fats are essential for so much. I'm ready to learn how they get into our bodies.
Well, it starts with emulsification.
Emulsification, that involves bile, right?
Exactly. Bile salts can interact with both fats and water.
Because fats and water don't mix.
Right. Bile salts are emulsifiers, breaking down large fat globules into smaller droplets. This increases their surface area, making it easier for enzymes to work.
So bile salts are the prep crew getting the fats ready.
Perfect analogy. Once emulsified, pancreatic lipase steps in, breaking down triglycerides into monoglycerides and free fatty acids.
So triglycerides get taken apart. But don't those smaller parts just clump back together?
That's where micelles come in. They're like tiny shuttles, carrying those fatty acids and monoglycerides through the watery environment.
Little lipid lifeboats.
Exactly. And micelles are small enough to be absorbed by the enterocytes.
So they deliver the fats, but what happens next?
Inside the enterocyte, those components are reformed into triglycerides.
Repackaged.
Precisely. Then they're coated with protein and combined with cholesterol and phospholipids to form chylomicrons.
Chylomicrons. Sound like something from a sci-fi movie.
They do. But they're essential for transporting fats. They're too big to enter capillaries directly, so they go into the lymphatic system.
Bypassing the bloodstream.
Right. The lymphatic system eventually drains into the bloodstream, delivering those fats to the body.
Wow, such an intricate system. So carbs, proteins, fats. What about vitamins? They're essential too.
Vitamins are crucial. Their absorption depends on whether they're fat-soluble or water-soluble.
So fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K probably go with the fats, right?
Right on. They're packaged into those micelles and chylomicrons.
Makes sense. But what about water-soluble vitamins like C and the Bs?
Most of them use carrier proteins, like a dedicated taxi service.
A specific transporter for each vitamin. That's incredible.
There are exceptions. Some, like pyridoxine, can just diffuse across.
Sneak through the cracks.
You could say that. But most rely on transporters to get into the bloodstream.
Okay, so we've got carbs, proteins, fats, vitamins. What about water and electrolytes?
Water absorption is mostly osmosis. The movement of those other things across the lining creates a pull that draws water along.
So water wants to go where the concentration is higher. It's all about balance.
Exactly. And remember, all that water secreted into the digestive tract? Well, most of it is reabsorbed in the small intestine.
That's why hydration is so important, especially when you're losing fluids.
Absolutely. Now, let's finish this section with iron absorption. It's carefully controlled because iron is essential, but can be toxic if there's too much.
So another balancing act.
Exactly. We absorb iron in its ferrous form, but most dietary iron is ferric.
So it needs to be converted.
Right. And stomach acid, HCl, helps with that conversion.
That makes sense. So people with low stomach acid might have iron absorption problem?
Precisely. It's one reason why iron deficiency anemia can be a complication after some stomach surgeries.
Wow, everything is connected. So once iron is in that absorbable form, how does it get in?
It uses a specific transporter protein in the duodenum.
Dedicated iron transporter.
There is. Once inside the enterocyte, iron can be stored or released into the bloodstream.
So there's a storage system too.
Exactly. Iron in the bloodstream binds to transferrin, which carries it to different tissues.
Transferrin is like iron chaperone.
Exactly. Now, there's a condition called hemochromatosis, which is iron overload.
Iron overload, how does that happen?
Some people absorb too much iron, and it builds up in tissues, which can damage organs.
So iron is both essential and potentially harmful.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of balance. Ready to move on to intestinal motility.
I'm ready. We've talked about how things break down and get absorbed, but how does stuff actually move through?
Great question. It's not passive. It starts with something called the migrating motor complex, or MMC.
The MMC, what's that?
Think of it as the cleaning crew. Between meals, when your small intestine is pretty empty, the MMC sweeps through, clearing out debris.
Like a Roomba for your gut. But what happens when you eat?
Then the real action begins. Two main types of motility take over: mixing contractions and peristalsis.
Mixing contractions.
Mm.
Those sound pretty straightforward.
They are. When a part of the small intestine fills with chyme, you get ring-like contractions that appear at intervals.
So like squeezing a tube of toothpaste back and forth?
Exactly. These contractions, called segmentation, mix the chyme with enzymes for good digestion.
And this mixing goes on as long as there are things to be absorbed.
Exactly. Now, there are also tonic contractions. Those are more sustained, and they isolate one section of the intestine from another.
Like temporary roadblocks.
Exactly. Tonic contractions, along with segmentation, help slow down the chyme, giving more time for absorption.
Slowing down to enjoy the scenery.
Great analogy. Now let's talk about peristalsis, which propels the chyme forward.
Peristalsis, the famous wave-like motion.
Exactly. It's a coordinated sequence of muscle contractions and relaxations, pushing the chyme along.
Like a crowd doing the wave.
I love that. And like a wave, peristalsis always goes one way, from mouth to, well,
Makes sense. How fast does it go?
The speed changes depending on where you are in the small intestine. Faster near the stomach, slower near the colon.
Why the difference?
Well, the first part is more about digestion, and the last part is more about absorption. Slowing things down gives more time to get those nutrients.
All about efficiency. You mentioned peristalsis increases after a meal. Why?
A couple of reasons. First, the chyme entering the duodenum stretches the wall, triggering reflexes that stimulate peristalsis.
So it's like the small intestine saying, time to get to work.
Exactly. Second, there's the gastroenteric reflex. The stomach basically tells the small intestine to get ready.
It's like an internal communication system. So what's the purpose of all this peristalsis?
Primarily, it slowly pushes the chyme towards the ileocecal valve, the door between the small and large intestines. This takes about 3 to 5 hours.
That's pretty slow.
It is, but it's also spreading the chyme along the lining, maximizing contact for absorption.
So it's not just about speed, it's about making the most of the journey.
Exactly. And there's also the gastrocranial reflex.
What does that one do?
After you eat, it increases peristalsis in the ileum, pushing anything left over into the colon.
Clearing the way for the next round. But what if there's something irritating in there, like with diarrhea?
That's when you get a peristaltic rush.
Peristaltic rush. Sounds intense.
It is a powerful, rapid peristalsis that quickly sweeps everything into the colon.
An emergency evacuation.
Exactly. Triggered by nerves, it's the body's way of expelling something harmful.
Makes sense. We talked about those bigger movements, but what about those tiny ones from the muscularis mucosae and the villi?
Those are important too. The muscularis mucosae makes folds in the lining, and muscle fibers in the villi make them contract.
So they're constantly kneading the lining.
Exactly. This increases surface area and helps move lymph, the fluid that carries absorbed fats.
A tiny circulatory system in the villi. Are these movements controlled by nerves and hormones too?
Mostly by local nerves triggered by the chyme.
So it's all about responding to the food.
Exactly. There's also a hormone, filicinin, that stimulates these movements.
A hormone for everything. Now, before we wrap up motility, let's touch on the ileocecal valve and sphincter, those gatekeepers between the small and large intestines.
The ileocecal valve is like a one-way door, stopping stuff from backing up from the colon. It's very strong, able to withstand a lot of pressure.
A heavy-duty doorstop. What about the ileocecal sphincter?
It's a ring of muscle that surrounds the opening. It's slightly closed most of the time, slowing down the flow from the ileum to the cecum.
So it's regulating the flow.
Exactly. And remember that gastroil reflex. It also relaxes the sphincter, allowing more through.
Opening the floodgates?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, there is so much going on in the small intestine. I think we need a break to process all this.
I agree. Let's take a moment to digest all this information before we continue our exploration. Welcome back to our exploration of the small intestine.
My brain's still trying to wrap itself around everything we covered. It's like a whole world in there with different communities and specialized jobs.
That's a great way to put it. And we haven't even touched on one of the most fascinating areas, the gut microbiome.
Right, all those trillions of bacteria and other microorganisms living in our intestines. It always seemed kind of abstract to me, but now that we've seen how intricate the small intestine is, I get why the microbiome is such a big deal.
Exactly. They're not just passive passengers. They're actively involved in digestion, absorption, even immune function. The list goes on and on.
So like a whole other team working alongside our own cells.
Precisely. For instance, they can break down certain fibers that we can't digest on our own. It's like having a built-in fermentation crew.
Extracting energy from food that would otherwise go to waste.
Exactly. And they produce short-chain fatty acids, things like butyrate, which are really good for our gut health, and even our immune system.
Hold on, they're producing things that affect our immune system.
They are. They're constantly communicating with our immune cells, helping to train them. They can influence inflammation, even the development of immune cells.
Wow, that's incredible. So a healthy, diverse microbiome isn't just about digestion, it's about our whole immune system.
Absolutely. And it goes even deeper than that. There's growing evidence that the gut microbiome can actually impact our mood, our behavior, even how we think.
Wait, what? How is that even possible?
It's still being studied, but it seems the gut microbiome can communicate with the brain through different pathways: nerves, hormones, immune signals. They can even influence neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, which affect our mood.
So the bacteria in my gut are messing with my head. That's both amazing and a little creepy.
It is a powerful concept. It really shows how interconnected our bodies are. What happens in the gut doesn't stay in the gut.
That's a great point. It's not just an isolated organ, it's part of this complex web that affects everything.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those mucosal and villus movements we discussed. Remember how those tiny contractions help maximize absorption? Well, they're also influenced by the gut microbiome.
Oh, right. Those tiny muscle contractions, the bacteria are affecting even those.
It seems so. Certain bacteria can actually stimulate those
Hmm.
contractions, making sure everything is mixed well and exposed to the lining for absorption.
It's like they're helping to keep things moving along, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Exactly. A great example of how our cells and the microbes work together.
I'm starting to see the small intestine as this incredibly dynamic ecosystem where everything is connected.
I'm glad you see it that way. It's not just a tube, it's a bustling city of activity.
Okay, so we know the microbiome is essential for a healthy small intestine. But what about when things go wrong? What happens when the microbiome is out of whack?
That's a great question, and it's a hot topic in research. When the balance is off, it's called dysbiosis, and it can have a lot of negative effects.
Like what kinds of effects?
Well, it's been linked to a bunch of things. Digestive problems like IBS and IBD, metabolic disorders like obesity and type 2 diabetes.
So an imbalance in gut bacteria can contribute to some serious conditions.
It can, and there's evidence it can also affect our immune system, making us more vulnerable to infections and autoimmune diseases.
Wow, it's amazing how something as small as bacteria can have such a huge impact.
It really is. It shows how important it is to have a healthy, balanced gut microbiome.
So how do we do that? What are the keys to a thriving gut microbiome?
Diet is a big one. Eating lots of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains provides the fiber that our good bacteria need. And fermented foods, like yogurt and sauerkraut, can introduce beneficial bacteria.
So it's those healthy eating habits again.
They make a real difference. And just as important is what we avoid: processed foods, sugary drinks, unhealthy fats. Those can disrupt the balance.
So it's all about finding that balance again.
Exactly. And we can't forget about stress. Chronic stress can really mess with the gut microbiome.
Because stress affects our whole body, including our gut.
Right. So managing stress is important too. Things like meditation, yoga, spending time in nature can all help.
What about antibiotics? They kill bacteria, so I imagine they can have a big impact on the microbiome.
You're absolutely right. Antibiotics are important for treating infections, but they can also kill off the good bacteria in our gut, leading to dysbiosis.
So we should use them carefully.
Absolutely. And if you need them, talk to your doctor about ways to support your gut health during and after.
This is all such valuable information. This deep dive into the small intestine has been eye-opening. It's an amazing organ, and it affects so much of our overall health.
I agree. It's an organ we need to respect and take care of, and by taking care of our gut health, we're taking care of ourselves.
Okay, I need a minute to process all this. But there's still more to explore, isn't there? More to discover in the world of the small intestine.
You're right. There's so much more. Let's dive into some of the latest research and emerging frontiers in gut health.
Wow, that gut microbiome stuff is really something else.
It really changes how we think about health. And it's not even the end of the story, you know?
So what else is out there? What has researchers excited about the small intestine these days?
Well, personalized nutrition is a hot topic.
Personalized nutrition. So figuring out the best diet for each individual person, not just a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. We all have different genes, different lifestyles, and of course, different gut microbiomes.
Right. What works for one person might not be the best for someone else. It's like trying to wear someone else's shoes. They just don't fit right.
Perfect analogy. So scientists are trying to figure out how to use information about your gut microbiome to create a diet just for you.
So you could get a gut microbiome test and then, boom, a custom meal plan. That's the future.
It's closer than you think, actually. There are companies already doing microbiome testing and giving diet advice based on the results. It's still early, but the potential is huge.
It's like having a nutritionist that knows your gut inside and out.
It's a powerful idea.
Hmm.
It shows how important it is to keep researching the small intestine and all the things that influence it.
Speaking of influences, that gut-brain connection we talked about, the idea that gut bacteria can affect our mood, that still blows my mind.
It's a fascinating area,
Yeah.
and it has huge implications for how we approach mental health.
So it's not just about eating for physical health, but for mental and emotional well-being, too.
Exactly. Having a healthy gut microbiome seems to be key for that gut-brain connection to work well.
What can we do to help that connection? Is it all about diet, or are there other things?
Diet is a big one, for sure. Lots of fiber from fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes. Those all feed the beneficial bacteria.
The good old healthy eating advice strikes again.
It really does make a difference. Fermented foods are good too, because they actually introduce beneficial bacteria.
Like yogurt, kefir, kimchi, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And just as important is avoiding the stuff that messes up the balance. Processed foods, sugary drinks, those can disrupt the gut microbiome.
So it's finding that balance, like you said before.
You got it. And don't forget stress. We know chronic stress can really throw the microbiome off balance.
Stress affects everything, our gut included.
It does. So finding ways to manage stress is really important. Meditation, yoga, just getting out in nature, those can all help.
What about exercise? Does that play a role in gut health and that gut-brain connection?
There's more and more evidence that regular exercise is good for the gut microbiome too.
So it's another piece of the puzzle.
Right. It seems that a holistic approach, taking care of your diet, exercise, stress, and making healthy choices overall, is the best way to nurture that gut-brain connection.
Taking care of the whole package. This has been an amazing journey through the small intestine. I feel like we've only scratched the surface, though.
It is a complex and incredible organ.
And it all starts with something so basic, the food we eat.
It really is quite amazing.
Thanks to all our listeners for coming along on this deep dive into the small intestine. We hope you have a new appreciation for this amazing, often overlooked organ.
Remember, a happy gut is a healthy gut. Take care of yourselves, look after your microbiome, and keep exploring the fascinating world inside you.
And that's a wrap for this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep those good gut vibes going strong.